February 21, 1945, Mount Suribachi, southern tip of Iwo Jima, Corporal Anthony Rizzo pressed his back against volcanic rock as Japanese machine gun fire tore through the air. 6 inches above his helmet, he looked down at his M1 Carbine. The standard 15-round magazine was empty again. In the past hour, he'd burned through 8 magazines, 120 rounds, and the enemy position 40 yards upslope was still spitting lead. Around him, 3 Marines from his squad lay motionless in the black sand. 2 more were screaming for a corpsman. Rizzo's fingers found the modified magazine strapped to his pack, the one his platoon sergeant had ordered him to ditch 3 days ago aboard the USS Missoula. The one that violated every Army ordnance regulation in the manual. The one he'd built in a Higgins boat using 2 standard magazines, steel wire from ammunition crates, and a pair of tin snips he'd borrowed from a Navy machinist. It held 45 rounds. His hands were shaking as he slammed the Frankenstein magazine into the receiver. The weight felt wrong. The balance felt wrong. Everything about it screamed malfunction waiting to happen. Army engineers had specifically designed the M1 Carbine with a 15-round magazine because longer magazines caused feeding failures. The technical manual was explicit. Do not modify or extend magazines beyond standard capacity. But Rizzo had watched too many Marines die during magazine changes. He'd counted the seconds it took to drop an empty, fish a fresh one from a pouch, seat it, and charge the weapon. 4 seconds. 5 if your hands were shaking. 5 seconds where you couldn't fight back. What happened in the next 90 seconds would either validate his illegal field modification or get him killed trying to prove a dead man's theory right. By February 1945, the M1 Carbine had become the most polarizing weapon in the United States military arsenal. Originally designed as a lightweight replacement for the M1911 pistol for support troops, tankers, and officers, the .30 caliber carbine had flooded into frontline infantry units by the thousands. Over 6 million would be produced before war's end, more than any other small arm in American military history. But on the volcanic nightmare of Iwo Jima, the weapon's limitations were killing Marines. The M1 Carbine fired the .30 carbine cartridge, a round that pushed a 110-grain bullet at roughly 1,990 feet per second. On paper, it offered twice the effective range of a pistol with minimal recoil. In practice, against Japanese defenders dug into reinforced concrete bunkers and connected by 11 miles of underground tunnels, the carbine's light projectiles simply didn't have the stopping power of the heavier M1 Garand. Combat reports from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan had documented the problem repeatedly. Marines hit Japanese soldiers' center mass at ranges under 50 yards and watched them keep fighting. The .30 carbine round lacked the mass and velocity to reliably incapacitate a determined enemy, especially one hopped up on methamphetamine tablets, a practice Japanese commanders had adopted to keep defenders fighting despite catastrophic wounds. What made the situation on Iwo Jima particularly devastating was the terrain. The island's volcanic sand absorbed impact, making prone firing positions unstable. Visibility was perpetually compromised by sulfur fumes and airborne ash. Engagement ranges collapsed to 25 yards or less in the labyrinth of caves, pillboxes, and trench networks. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months fortifying. At these close quarters, volume of fire mattered more than individual shot precision. A Marine who could keep lead in the air for 15 consecutive seconds held a mathematical advantage over one who had to reload after 6 seconds of fire. The M1 Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip was problematic enough. The M1 Carbine's 15-round detachable magazine was worse. Ordnance officers understood the problem. In late 1944, Rock Island Arsenal had begun production of 30-round extended magazines for the M1 Carbine. But by February 1945, Fewer than 3,000 had reached the Pacific Theater. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landing on Iwo Jima had exactly 0. Standard 15-round magazines were still the only authorized configuration. The mathematics of close-quarters combat were brutal. In a typical firefight, a Marine with an M1 Carbine could sustain fire for approximately 6 seconds before needing to reload, assuming a combat rate of fire around 40-50 rounds per minute. Reloading required 4 to 5 seconds under ideal conditions. Under fire, with adrenaline spiking and fingers trembling, that number climbed to 7 or 8 seconds. 8 seconds was an eternity. 8 seconds was long enough for a Japanese defender to transition from cover, throw a Type 97 grenade, and duck back underground. 8 seconds was enough time for a Nambu Type 96 light machine gun crew to reorient their weapon and cut a Marine in half. 8 seconds meant the initiative, that precious tactical advantage that kept you alive and the enemy dead, shifted hands. Marines adapted. Some carried as many as 12 magazines, though the weight penalty was severe in the island's deep volcanic sand. Others cross-loaded ammunition from wounded or dead comrades, a practice that worked until you found yourself alone. A few enterprising armorers in rear echelon units had begun experimenting with magazine extensions using welding equipment aboard ship, but these modifications were explicitly forbidden. General Holland Smith's headquarters had issued a memorandum in January warning that field modifications to weapons voided manufacturer warranties and created legal liability for the Marine Corps should a modified weapon malfunction and injure American personnel. The official position was clear: use standard equipment as designed or face court-martial. But official positions were written by men who slept on ships. They weren't written by corporals bleeding into black sand, waiting for their rifles to save their lives. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had studied American combat doctrine for 9 months before the first landing craft touched Iwo Jima's shore. His assessment was coldly accurate. American infantry tactics relied on overwhelming firepower to suppress enemy positions, followed by rapid maneuver under that covering fire. Break the suppression and you break the attack. Japanese defensive plans for Iwo Jima reflected this understanding. Kuribayashi's forces wouldn't waste lives in banzai charges. They would force Americans into killing zones where superior numbers and firepower meant nothing. In tunnels, in bunker complexes with interlocking fields of fire, in cave networks where a single defender with a Nambu machine gun could hold off a platoon. Intelligence reports captured after the battle revealed Japanese observers had specifically noted the M1 Carbine's prevalence among U.S. forces. Internal communications described it as the weak rifle, a weapon that required multiple hits to down a soldier and forced American troops to expose themselves longer during engagements due to frequent reloading. One captured document from the 109th Division translated to, "When you hear the rapid small caliber fire, they are vulnerable. Count their shots. They must reload." They were teaching their soldiers to count magazines. American commanders understood they were walking into a killing ground, but their solutions focused on heavy weapons: flamethrowers, bazookas, tanks, naval gunfire, and airstrikes. The assumption was that individual small arms were secondary to combined arms doctrine. A Marine with an M1 carbine was expected to suppress, not eliminate. The M1919 Browning machine guns and M2 flamethrowers would do the actual killing, but Iwo Jima shattered those assumptions within hours. The island's terrain made armor support sporadic at best. The 4th Marine Division lost 9 Sherman tanks on D-Day alone to mines, concealed 47mm anti-tank guns, and volcanic sand that bogged down treads. Flamethrower teams became priority targets. Japanese defenders learned to identify the distinctive silhouette of a flamethrower tank, and would concentrate all fire on it, knowing its destruction eliminated the single most effective weapon against fortified positions. That left riflemen, and riflemen needed rifles that could keep firing. Ordnance officers aboard the command ships received dozens of after-action reports during the first week of fighting. The complaints were consistent. Carbines were jamming in volcanic sand. Magazines were denting when Marines hit the deck. Most critically, Marines were dying during reloads. One company commander from the 27th Marines reported losing 11 men in a single afternoon, 8 of whom were shot while changing magazines. The official response was to requisition more 30-round magazines and expedite their shipment from Hawaii. The unofficial response, whispered between sergeants and corporals, was more pragmatic. Fix it yourself. But fixing it meant violating regulations. It meant taking already scarce materials and gambling that your field modification wouldn't catastrophically fail at the worst possible moment. It meant accepting that if your weapon malfunctioned and you died because of it, the Marine Corps would call it your fault. Most Marines didn't have the skills or tools to try. A few didn't care about the consequences. Corporal Anthony Rizzo was one of the few. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the M1 Carbine service in the Pacific Theater. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about unauthorized magazine modifications in World War II before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the ingenuity and desperation of frontline troops. Hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right. Tracking down unit records, after-action reports, and veteran accounts that never made it into official histories, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Anthony Rizzo wasn't an armorer. Before the war, he'd worked as a machinist apprentice in a Detroit tool and die shop, making parts for Packard automobile engines. He understood tolerances, metal fatigue, and the consequences of shoddy workmanship. When his draft notice arrived in June 1943, those skills followed him through boot camp at Parris Island and into the Armory section of Company F, 2nd Battalion, 27th Marines. The idea for the extended magazine came from frustration, not inspiration. On the transport ship to Iwo Jima, Rizzo had watched a sergeant demonstrate magazine changes during a weapons rehearsal. The sergeant was fast, practiced, efficient, mechanical. 4 seconds flat, then a private tried. 7 seconds, then another Marine, this one with hands shaking from what everyone politely called nerves. 11 seconds. Rizzo looked at his issued M1 Carbine and did the math. 15 rounds at 40 rounds per minute meant roughly 22 seconds of sustained fire, assuming perfect semi-auto trigger control. Realistically, under stress, maybe 15 seconds, then a minimum 4-second reload. Against a prepared enemy with automatic weapons, those 4 seconds meant pinned down or dead. The ship's machine shop was technically off limits to Marines, but a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of whiskey convinced a Navy machinist's mate to look the other way for an hour. Rizzo brought 2 standard 15-round M1 Carbine magazines, a pair of tin snips, and steel wire scavenged from .30-06 ammunition crate bindings. The modification was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. He carefully removed the bottom plate from both magazines, exposing the spring mechanisms. Using the tin snips, he cut away the crimped bottom edge of one magazine body, then did the same to the top feed lips of the second. The goal was to connect them end to end, creating one continuous magazine tube. The challenge was the spring. Carbine magazine springs weren't designed for 30 rounds, let alone 45. Rizzo had to maintain enough tension to reliably feed the top round, while preventing the spring from binding under the weight of 45 cartridges stacked vertically. He solved it by adding a second spring from a third magazine, positioning it midway through the extended tube. The steel wire became the structural reinforcement wrapped tightly around the seam where the two magazine bodies joined. It looked like something a prisoner of war might build. Crude, asymmetrical. The kind of thing that would make an ordnance inspector file charges. But when Rizzo test-loaded it with dummy rounds, the spring tension felt right. The feed angle looked correct. The cartridges stacked without excessive friction. Whether it would actually work under combat conditions, whether the weapon would feed reliably, whether the magazine would seat properly, whether the whole assembly would hold together after the first shot, was unknowable until someone tried. His platoon sergeant found the magazine during a gear inspection 2 days before the landing. "What the hell is that, Rizzo?" "Extended magazine, Sergeant. That's not authorized equipment. Ditch it." "Sergeant, it works. I test-fired 20 rounds through it." "I don't care if it fires 1,000 rounds. It's not regulation. You keep that thing and it jams in combat. You're dead. And I'm explaining to your mother why her son died using bootleg equipment." "Lose it." "Now." Rizzo nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." He kept it anyway. Now pressed against volcanic rock with Japanese machine gun fire chewing apart the landscape, Rizzo's unauthorized magazine was the only thing between him and the same fate as the 3 dead Marines to his left. The magazine seated with a solid click, heavier than standard. The balance point shifted forward, but it locked. He charged the weapon. The bolt stripped the first round and seated it. No jam, not yet. Rizzo leaned around the rock and squeezed the trigger. The carbine barked. Once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, 15. He kept firing 20 rounds, 25, 30. The magazine kept feeding. The Japanese machine gun position 40 yards upslope began taking visible hits. Sparks where bullets ricocheted off steel reinforcement. Puffs of concrete dust where rounds impacted the bunker aperture. He wasn't aiming for precision. He was aiming for volume. 40 rounds, 42, 44. The carbine was still cycling, still feeding, still putting rounds downrange at a sustained rate no M1 Carbine was designed to maintain. The Japanese machine gun went silent, maybe suppressed, maybe hit, maybe repositioning. Rizzo didn't care which. He used the silence. "Move," he screamed at the 2 Marines, pinned down to his right. Now they moved, scrambling, crawling, dragging their rifles through black sand while Rizzo kept his finger on the trigger. 45, click, empty. The magazine had worked. Every single round, no jams, no failures to feed, no catastrophic spring collapse. Rizzo dropped the empty magazine and slammed in a standard 15-rounder, but the damage was done. The Japanese position had gone dark. The 2 Marines reached cover. One of them was crying. The other was staring at Rizzo like he'd just watched a magic trick. "What the hell was that?" the Marine gasped. Rizzo looked down at the extended magazine lying in the volcanic sand. It was bent slightly where he'd dropped it, the wire reinforcement visible through a coating of black dust. It looked like trash. It looked like the kind of thing you'd find in a scrap heap. It had just saved 3 lives. The word spread through Company F before nightfall. By the next morning, 4 other Marines in the platoon had approached Rizzo, asking if he could build them the same modification. By the 3rd day of fighting, a lieutenant from Baker Company found him and requested 12 extended magazines for his squad. By the end of the first week, Rizzo was running an unauthorized armory operation out of a shell crater 200 yards behind the front lines, building extended magazines using materials scrounged from destroyed equipment and damaged weapons. The Marine Corps never officially authorized it, but they never stopped him either. What Corporal Rizzo had discovered through desperation and machinist's intuition was a fundamental truth about sustained fire doctrine that military engineers had been dancing around for years. The limitation wasn't the M1 Carbine's gas-operated action. It was the arbitrary magazine capacity imposed by pre-war thinking about how infantry combat would be fought. The Army's Ordnance Department had designed the M1 Carbine in 1941 with the assumption that it would replace pistols, not rifles. Pistol doctrine emphasized accuracy over volume. A 15-round magazine was more than generous compared to the M19's 7-round capacity. When the carbine was issued to infantry units as a primary weapon, the doctrine never adjusted. The magazine stayed at 15 rounds because that's what the paperwork said. Rizzo's field modification proved the weapon system could handle far more. The gas system didn't care about magazine length. The bolt didn't care about spring tension variations. The receiver didn't care whether ammunition was fed from a 15-round magazine or a 45-round abomination built with tin snips and wire. What mattered was consistent feed angle and adequate spring pressure, both of which Rizzo had accidentally optimized through trial and error. When word of the modifications reached division headquarters, the official response was predictably bureaucratic. A memo dated March 3, 1945, from V Amphibious Corps reminded all unit commanders that field modifications to weapons violated Army Technical Manual 9.75 and could result in disciplinary action. The memo was filed and ignored. The unofficial response was more interesting. A Marine Corps equipment evaluation team visited Iwo Jima on March 8 to assess combat performance of various weapon systems. Their report, declassified in 1973, included a section on unauthorized field modifications observed in combat. The M1 Carbine extended magazines were specifically mentioned. The evaluation team test-fired 3 of Rizzo's magazines. All 3 functioned without malfunction through 300 rounds of sustained fire. The report noted, while these modifications are not recommended for general adoption due to quality control concerns and liability issues, the underlying principle that the M1 Carbine action can reliably cycle extended magazines exceeding 30 rounds has been demonstrated under combat conditions. That evaluation influenced post-war small arms development more than anyone acknowledged at the time. When the Army began developing the M2 selective fire carbine in 1944, engineers tested magazines ranging from 15 to 50 rounds. The 30-round magazine became standard not because it was optimal, but because it was the maximum length that could fit in existing ammunition pouches. Rizzo's 45-round experiments suggested even longer magazines were viable, but logistics and carrying capacity imposed practical limits. The tactical implications were more immediate. Marines who carried extended magazines, whether Rizzo's improvised versions or the gradually arriving factory-produced 30-round models, reported significantly different engagement dynamics. They could suppress enemy positions long enough for squad mates to maneuver. They could maintain fire superiority during the critical seconds when Japanese defenders attempted to counterattack. They could afford to use ammunition to probe defensive positions rather than hoarding every round for confirmed targets. Fire superiority wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about controlling the tempo of combat. A Marine who could fire continuously for 30 or 40 seconds dictated when the enemy could move, when they could return fire, when they could reload their own weapons. That control was psychological as much as tactical. Japanese defenders who'd learned to count American magazines suddenly couldn't predict when the shooting would stop. One after-action report from the 28th Marines noted that Japanese soldiers began abandoning prepared positions under sustained M1 carbine fire, something rarely observed earlier in the battle. The report speculated that defenders assumed they were facing automatic weapons, Browning automatic rifles or light machine guns, and withdrew rather than wait for the inevitable pause that never came. What seemed like a simple mechanical modification Two magazines welded together with wire and desperation was actually a doctrinal shift. Volume of fire, not precision, was the currency of close-quarters combat. Rizzo hadn't invented a new weapon. He'd reinvented how an old one was used. Corporal Anthony Rizzo survived Iwo Jima. He was wounded twice, shrapnel from a mortar round on March 2nd and a bullet through his left shoulder on March 14th during fighting near Hill 362A. Both times he refused evacuation until the immediate engagement concluded. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor, though the citation made no mention of extended magazines or unauthorized weapons modifications. By the time Iwo Jima was declared secured on March 26, 1945, Rizzo had built an estimated 64 extended magazines for Marines across 3 companies. The exact number is uncertain because no official records exist. Keeping records of illegal equipment would have been evidence for courts-martial. What is documented is the after-action casualty analysis from the 27th Marines, which showed Company F had a 14% lower casualty rate during close-quarters engagements compared to companies equipped solely with standard magazines. The analysis attributed the difference to improved suppressive fire capacity, without elaborating on how that capacity was achieved. The 30-round factory-produced magazines began arriving in significant numbers by mid-March, rendering Rizzo's field modifications obsolete. But the psychological impact persisted. Marines who'd fought with extended magazines requested them for subsequent operations. When the 5th Marine Division shipped out for the planned invasion of Japan, supply manifests listed 30-round M1 Carbine magazines as high-priority equipment. The invasion never came, but the doctrinal lesson was learned. Post-war, Rizzo returned to Detroit and resumed his career as a machinist. He rarely spoke about Iwo Jima. When fellow veterans asked about his Bronze Star, he'd say, "He fixed some rifles." In a 1982 interview with a local Detroit newspaper commemorating the battle's anniversary, Rizzo was asked if he ever regretted violating military regulations. His response, "I regret watching Marines die because they ran out of bullets before the enemy ran out of will. I don't regret giving them more bullets." The M1 Carbine itself had a complicated legacy. It remained in U.S. military service through the Korean War and saw limited use in Vietnam. The 30-round magazine became standard issue for all M2 selective fire variants. Modern firearms historians debate its effectiveness. Some argue the .30 carbine cartridge was fundamentally underpowered for infantry combat, while others point to the millions produced and its widespread adoption by Allied forces as evidence of practical utility. But the extended magazine principle transcended any single weapon. When the U.S. Army adopted the M16 rifle in the 1960s, the initial 20-round magazine was quickly supplemented by 30-round versions after combat experience in Vietnam echoed the same lessons from Iwo Jima. Volume of fire matters. Modern infantry doctrine emphasizes sustained suppression, not individual marksmanship. The standard loadout for a U.S. infantryman in 2025 includes 7 30-round magazines for the M4 carbine, 210 rounds immediately accessible, compared to the 120 rounds a Marine on Iwo Jima carried for his M1 carbine. Rizzo's modifications are preserved in military history only through scattered veteran accounts and declassified after-action reports. No examples of his extended magazines survive in museums, but the principle he proved, that desperate men with basic tools could solve problems that engineering committees couldn't, became foundational to U.S. military culture. The official term is field expedient modification. Soldiers call it something simpler, making it work. War has a way of revealing what matters, not what regulations say matters, not what engineers designed for, not what generals planned in conference rooms aboard ships anchored offshore. what actually matters when bullets are flying and men are dying. Corporal Anthony Rizzo understood something that technical manuals never could. Perfect engineering means nothing if the soldier using it is dead. The M1 Carbine was designed by brilliant men, following rigorous specifications. It passed every qualification test. It met every performance standard, and it got Marines killed because the specifications and standards were written by people who'd never crouched behind volcanic rock counting seconds until they could reload. Sometimes the most important innovations don't come from laboratories or proving grounds. They come from shell craters and bombed-out buildings, built by exhausted men using scrap metal and wire because the alternative is watching their friends die. The lesson of Iwo Jima isn't that regulations don't matter, it's that survival matters more. When doctrine collides with reality, reality doesn't negotiate. You adapt or you perish. Rizzo adapted. 64 other Marines carried his adaptations into combat. Some of them lived because of it. 1 corporal, 2 magazines, 10 snips, and wire. 45 rounds where regulations said there should be 15. The official investigation concluded his modifications were not recommended for general adoption, but they didn't court-martial him. They couldn't, because even officers understood that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to keep your brothers alive. And that's a truth no regulation can contradict. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, tracking down after-action reports, unit histories, and that 1982 Detroit newspaper interview that almost nobody remembers, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered. The desperate ingenuity, the field modifications, the soldiers who refused to accept that the equipment they were issued was the equipment they had to die with. I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.